Well, as a card-carrying science nerd, I can't be more thrilled to celebrate being able to read DNA, the code of life, and to understand it. And it's just marvelous to be here with you to celebrate this. We're here to not just celebrate the successes of genomics, but to peer into the future. And today we have a remarkable panel who's really leading that at the forefront. And so I'd like to ask you to tell me what you think is the present. What are you most excited about at the present? And then we'll talk more about what the future might bring. So Eric, you've been in this business long enough, probably well before genomics and precision medicine entered our lexicon. What do you see as the most exciting applications today?
Right. Well, it's great to be with you, Francis, and the group. And clearly, it always takes longer than you'd like to think. And I think the one that excites me the most is what Francis mentioned in his opening. And that is what we're doing here in San Diego, Genomics, which is an institute within the Children's Hospital, which is, I think you know, San Diego is the second largest county in California. And they do sequencing, not just sequencing, but including the entire medical literature, AI tools that take all the records and all the results, and the sequencing interpretation all within 12 hours. And they have saved the lives of countless number of babies and young children, particularly newborns though. And this is a program now that's being exported throughout many other health systems in the country and starting to happen internationally. And we're lucky to partner with them. And I think it's exemplary. And what's interesting, Francis, one other point is that most things that are innovative, particularly in genomics, start with adults. And this is, I think, the most innovative program combining genomics and AI, and is starting with newborns.
So who could not want to use this for babies? What's really holding up the rollout of this across the world?
Well, now that it's packaged so that it doesn't take a neonatologist that's experiencing a particular rare mutation, it's really set up to be applicable and generalizable throughout. So I think it's going to get legs now. We have at least a dozen centers in the U.S. that Stephen Kingsmore has pioneered this program to export. And hopefully this will become the norm. But right now, of course, it represents a tiny fraction of sick neonates who don't have a diagnosis. And what's remarkable too is, as the case that Francis mentioned, there's so many that would have irrevocable brain damage if their diagnosis isn't made very quickly. That's why this 12 hours of sequencing, interpretation, management has to be done. Because if it takes days, or if it's never done, you can imagine the results. So someday, I think this will be the standard of care. I hope it happens quickly.
Well, we'll talk more about the roadblocks. Amy, tell me what you're most excited about. A great example, concrete example of what's happening today.
Yeah, one of the most exciting things, I think, and that's happening today with we have about 50,000 patients at Providence get diagnosed with solid tumors each year, and a good half of them are now getting deep tumor sequencing and personalized therapy. So instead of carpet bombing a tumor, you can actually create a much more personalized plan that targets the exact mutations in that particular tumor to really reduce, enhance the efficacy and reduce the side effects that are unnecessary.
So what are the real outcomes, though, that you've been seeing?
So
we all know that technology is amazing. What are the outcomes and what is limiting it?
So the easy outcomes are process outcomes, right? We know that significantly more patients are getting targeted therapy, including patients in rural areas, because Providence not only has care centers in busy downtown places like LA and Seattle and Portland, but also takes care of patients in the outer islands, up in Alaska and in rural Montana. And so we were able, through virtual tumor boards, to be able to deliver personalized therapy into areas that otherwise people would not have access. So that's a process outcome. What we are studying actively is the difference in not just side effects of therapy, that's a process outcome, but in survival. long-term survival. And our hypothesis is that long-term survival is better with more effective therapy, targeted therapy.
So you say your hypothesis is that. What numbers do we have? Does anybody want to jump in on this? What are the real numbers for the benefits of genomics, and when will we have those? You're doing a study along these lines, right?
Yeah, we are doing several studies along these lines, and with anything, long-term cancer survival is considered 5 years, and the ultimate outcome is does it change survival? So you have to have enough people who've been diagnosed 5 years ago to be able to see the survival benefit. So the process outcomes are quicker, the significant, life-changing benefits like you live longer take a little bit longer to gather.
But you're sure they'll be there?
I'm positive they'll be, well, my hypothesis is they'll be there, but I'm pretty sure that's a very valid hypothesis.
I imagine. Jay, tell me what you're excited about.
Well, I think it's very clear that a lot of the hard science has been done now. We have systems that scale, we have bioinformatics that work, and we have many applications which have been validated. But it turns out, I think the hard part is the implementation science that says, how do you implement these things at scale? And by the way, this isn't unique to molecular testing. This is a problem in our healthcare system because our healthcare system is designed around providers and hospitals and not around consumers, right? So we go through the pandemic and we get a wake-up call around consumer-centric care, right? PCR is a good example. We needed self-collection modes there. And then general healthcare falls off a cliff during the pandemic because we don't have a consumer-centric care system. So what I'm excited about is the content that we've known about for years now, like in pharmacogenetics. I mean, we may have known for the last 10 years important associations. And the funny thing is, Eric and I did a clinical study in 2009 trying to implement pharmacogenetics, and it was not the best Eric Topol study. Right? It didn't work out so well. But
why is that?
Well, it didn't work so well because it was provider-centric. So what's happened in the pharmacogenetics field the last 2 years is very exciting. And there was a Kentucky State Teachers Union study, and then in Quest we offered to 2,000 Quest employees with known pharmacogenetic interactions, pharmacogenetic testing, but then they get a virtual pharmacy service to work out the changes in the regimen that should occur, and a full comprehensive medication management, which is really valuable. And then that pharmacist then goes to the physician office and suggests the changes. And 90% of the time those changes are made, and we have a really good financial and clinical ROI there, but it's all because the whole service was designed around the consumer, which is the employee in this
Novel
case.
idea.
Yeah.
Oh. I'll bet Javier has something to say about that idea.
Yeah,
Well,
no,
that's
absolutely.
what you're excited about.
Yeah, well, on our side, we're excited about how we're being able to bring whole genome sequencing as part of people's roadmap for a preventive health journey. Until today, I remember I got my genome sequenced first, probably 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And the amount of information, or the quality of the information I got didn't have a real impact in my life. What we're doing today really changes people's lives. We just presented data by Veritas and a couple of hospitals around the world that show that up to 20% of the people, the individuals that get their genome sequenced, are carriers of pathogenic variants that have a clinical impact. And the way those pathogenic variants are addressed within a clinical setting and the amount of information they're able to provide to their physicians and how that changes and improves their lives, it's not only about living longer. We finally have, through all these tools, the ability to live longer and healthier. And I think that is happening already. It is happening today.
Do you agree the hard science has already been done, though? Jay said that. We scientists never agree with such a statement. But
well, we keep on learning every day. It's, we reanalyze our data every single day. And every time we find tons of new data, novel variants that were previously undescribed, our data shows that approximately 10% of the variants we find in our patients were previously undescribed and were not present in public databases. So we continue learning every single day. And the way we approach this journey and bringing together data science with real genetics and real data is moving us towards learning more and more and being able to really improve the output of that data we get.
Mm-hmm. Can I pile on that?
Yeah, please.
Because
Jump in.
the answer is no. Science is not done. And I would say we have a significant volume of information that's helpful and can make a difference in people's lives if you happen to be European American or even Latino. But if you're African American, we have a lot less information available to us right now. And so one of the focuses that we've been doing is ensuring that we have a broad representation of the people that's representative of the communities we serve in the populations that we're doing whole genome sequencing, because we need to be able to have more information about everybody on the planet, not just people that look like me.
That's right, it is personalized, and we're all different in different ways. Catalina, I bet you have something to say on that, but first tell me what you're excited about in a real today application of genomics for health.
Yeah, I think for me now, the most exciting in genomics was what the role genomics played during this COVID-19 pandemic. In Canada, we actually started an initiative called the Canadian COVID Genomics Network, CanCoGen, a $40 million initiative aiming to sequence 150,000 viral genomes and 10,000 whole human genomes. And initially, this project was just all about generating just generating the 150,000 sequences of the virus and the 10,000 sequences of the humans. But very, very quickly, we started to see the impact this project had in informing public health and policy decisions. So actually, one of the first examples was when the US and Canada border was closed. A very important data point used to make that decision was the movement of the virus and how the sequence data and the genomic data was informing policymakers to make those decisions. For me, it was just incredible to see that we are at the point now, as we say, basically genomics is out of the lab, where we can use this data to make those very important public health and policy decisions. And the other thing is that as much as we say, all the research is almost done, and we have already a fundamental basis, we still had challenges in terms of capacity building. And that opportunity with this initiative in Canada gave us, the possibility to build capacity, decentralized sequencing, as opposed to have it in just one centralized big lab, have all the public health agencies across Canada equipped, trained, and ready to use this technology. So basically a game changer during the pandemic, and also very interesting to see politicians also talking about genomics and opening the door to a whole different dimension of this technology today.
But do we have the workforce and capacity really to do that and to scale appropriately? And actually, this brings me into the next topic, which really is, how do we accelerate this promise? We all see we're barely scratching the surface, right, of what genomics can do for human health. How do we accelerate this? And what do you see as the major roadblocks? And if you can offer ideas for solutions, that's even better.
Well, if I think about our experience with the CanCoGen initiative in Canada, one of the biggest roadblocks for us, and I think internationally, during the COVID pandemic and the genomic surveillance initiatives was data sharing. So data sharing was a big challenge for us in Canada, and being able to integrate, to really share the data across the country between provinces, internationally. And as we say, the virus sees no borders, and yet we keep our data in little silos.
You still use fax machines like we do to send data back and forth? Is that how it's done? Yeah.
Well, we still, it's incredible. We are with all this amazing technology, but yet sharing was a big roadblock. And as you say, also capacity, in particular, not in data generation, but the analytics. Mm-hmm. So I think we are now with the capacity to sequence genomes super fast, maybe lower cost or much lower cost than before, but it's the analytics that is a real challenge still.
Well, Jay, you were mentioning that there were some real other ideas for that not everybody wants to share their data, right? Amy, you have a lot of experience with this, and so do everybody here. So do people want to share their data, and why not? And if they don't, what are the alternatives? Jay, why don't you start?
Let me pick up on that, which is there's been this debate over time about genetic data and should it be in EMRs and how do we have it throughout our healthcare system. And I think we've come to appreciate that the health system doesn't want genetic data in their EMR, because I just saw my patient, Mr. Topol, who dropped dead, and I should have known that he had a mutation, right? And
that's a pretty provocative statement.
Right? But ultimately, I believe what we need is that the patient can have a mechanism in a secure way to own and hold and move around their own genetic data, so that when I go to another health system or I go to another annotator, I'm able to engage with them and provide them that data. And there are efforts going on to try to create that, and it's going to need standards for data formats. And but I think that helps an awful lot, again, make it consumer-centric, so I own my genomic data and I can go to a provider with it, or I can go get an insight from a counselor around it. I would also say the widespread adoption of virtual care is required to scale genomics in this country and beyond, right? You got to have genetic counselors and doctors available in a virtual format, because not everyone can get into the health center and have that. What we would love to have for everyone is an expert care in a health center like that. To really scale this, we have to have virtual solutions like the virtual pharmacy service I pointed out.
Eric, nobody's thought more about data than you. Share some of your ideas, not just pain points.
Well, I think the solution right now for genomics to get clinical, we've seen it, of course, in certain select areas, like I mentioned, the neonatal, Francis mentioned undiagnosed rare diseases, cancer, obviously a genomic disease, but we haven't seen it get cut across all of medicine. And I think what is the missing link there, especially, is compelling data that it shows this a benefit. So that would be, for example, randomized trials that show you do whole genome sequencing versus the usual care, and you show that the outcomes are better. Then the medical community will say, that's it. We can't resist any longer, because there's natural resistance when there's lack of education, lack of compelling evidence. So where there is the evidence that's exceptionally strong, it's just in these pockets of how we care for patients today. But it could be much broader if we get that data. I just one other point, getting back to the pandemic, and I do think this will help, because even though most of it's pathogen sequencing, at least genomics is getting in the mainstream. And look what happened, Tulio and the group from South Africa here, when they shared their data, they were the group that, I think you remember, were the first to detect the beta variant and Omicron. And they suffered because of sharing the data. As, we won't have people come from the continent of Africa to these countries. It was just preposterous. So we have to have data sharing where there's not a punitive aspect, no less there is the reward that the collaborations we need to have compelling data to move the needle in medicine has to be the norm.
Yeah. And of course, we need the data sharing for science, right? I think you were telling us, Javier, that only 50% of your customers agreed to share their data. You've seen a slightly higher version, but...
Yeah, that's right. Of course, I come from Europe, and we operate across most of the world, and it changes by region or geography. But the GDPR policy in Europe is probably much stronger than data policy is here in the US. However, probably the key word here for us is trust. It's about people, when they are within an environment that they trust whoever is receiving the data. They have no problem whatsoever in sharing it. We provide our whole genome for health individuals within a clinical setting. And people understand that if their physicians, the healthcare provider, the hospital has access to the data, it is going to have an immediate impact, which is going to be beneficial for them. So it's about people not knowing, not understanding what is going to happen to their data and how that is going to be shared, who is going to have access to it. Is their employer going to be able to learn something that will have a negative impact on their lives? We were discussing earlier before sportsmen, professional sportsmen. A lot of them prefer not to know. Now, what if my football club learns that I have a long QT syndrome and they don't allow me to continue playing? Now, we are seeing all the time professional sportsmen and sportswomen that are suffering from sudden death in the middle of a football or a sports field. So it's about how you share the data, who you share it with, and having the trust that it is going to be used in the most beneficial way for you.
Do you think that problem has been solved, or do you see solutions?
Well, I think it's about a commitment from both sides, from everyone. It's about not only the patient or the individuals feeling more comfortable sharing their data. It's about the healthcare providers and whoever has access to that data making a good use of it. I was saying at the beginning that I got my genome sequenced many years ago, and I received my FASTQ in a thumb drive, which as soon as I arrived back home in Spain, I put it into a safe in the bank. It was like, wow, this is the most precious thing I have. People are going to be able to clone me.
So you don't trust.
This was, imagine a world full of careers. It would be,
Yeah.
the end of the world. 12 years later, 13 years later, I understand that I need to share that data with science. I need to share the data with fellow researchers. I need to share that data with my physician. So in the end, it's about education. And education is not only about what to do with the information you get from your genome. It's also about the commitment you have with the community, the commitment you have with the scientific world, with your fellow citizens, about sharing your data to improve research and to learn more and more all the time.
Well, Catalina, you deal with this issue a lot. What are your thoughts on trust and data sharing?
Yes, well, trust is a super big component. And for us, one example of the lack of trust was to try and figure out across Canada who the privacy commissioners and what their role was in making decisions about data sharing. And we ended up really at the point where those privacy commissions were okay with the data being shared, but it was a matter of trust in the team that was generating the data and maybe prioritizing and capacity. But I think it's really getting to who is the decision maker, who really can help us ensure that this data is going to be treated and protected. We ended up also with what we call minimum metadata, which is just minimum data that was shared in terms of clinical data, so that there was no challenge around security and privacy, but yet we had the information, enough information to make decisions about the genomic surveillance and all the epidemiology and public health and policy decisions. So I think it's really examples like this pandemic that show us the use and benefits. What was interesting also, Francis, is that we actually had a survey for the public in Canada and asked, are you okay with us sharing the data? So we were somewhat...
What were the results?
There were about 70% of the people answering that survey would say, no problem. Mm-hmm. We are happy, please share my data, please share the data of my virus, the genome of my virus. It was more, in some cases, all the rules we created at the public health system as opposed to what the public and what the people want to do with their own data. Of course, they want to preserve the privacy and the safety, but there is the willingness to share, and in particular during a pandemic, as Eric said, I think this pandemic is teaching us really a lot on how we can use the power of genomics to make all these transformations in terms of data sharing and use of the data.
Our theory is if we can demonstrate value, if we can show that we're trustworthy, demonstrate value, and we always ask for permission, I do think the data is the patient's, but it's hard to know, if you get your thumb drive or your card with your genome on it, what does that mean, right? There needs to be a translation layer for patients. And so what we've been doing at Providence is we've been very transparent about asking for permission. We have a dynamic e-consult tool, e-consent tool, that allows people to toggle on and off what we're allowed to use their data for, and that we won't use it for anything they don't want us to. Of the 2,000 people that we've consented so far for whole genome sequencing, it's about 90% of people are opting in. Might be a skewed population because there are people who raise their hand early, but they understand that we need to not only use it for that individual's benefit, but to continue to learn from, because we'll never acquire more information and enough information to really understand all the alleles and all the variants that are pathogenic over time unless we continue to aggregate that data. So I think there's a nuance in there between it's the patient's data to control, but somebody's got to organize that data and make sense out of the data so that it can be useful into the future.
Yeah, can I just add something? I think Amy just touched on something very interesting, which is about returning value to the patient who gives us their DNA sample. And we're seeing more and more through this population screening programs around the world, the adherence rate is going down because people are not seeing any value for themselves. And in the end, human beings, most of us are selfish. So it's good, you can be part of a national screening program, but if you don't see value for yourself, if the results you are being returned don't add something to your life, in the end, people are not going to do it.
Well, in fact, let's talk about value and the benefits, Eric, that you brought up. In the end, genomics is a technology that has to demonstrate real value. How do we accelerate that demonstration? We're all believers, right? But that's not science and that's not real data. How do we accelerate the demonstration of that true value?
I think one of the really impressive works along that line was Geisinger Health System. So they got over 100,000 of their patients in this MyCode program they did in collaboration with Regeneron. They had exome sequencing, and they returned the data, and 5% of that population had pathogenic mutations, whether it was familial hypercholesterolemia, long QT, or other potentially fatal arrhythmias, BRCA and other familial cancer mutations. They didn't know, these people had no idea they had these mutations. Now, no one's taken that further to
So
return.
Doesn't that leave the patient in a difficult place?
Well, they did get counseling about that, yes. And you would say, you could extrapolate that all those people were helped because these were actionable. Every one of them was actionable mutations. But they didn't give them back all their pharmacogenomic data, all their carrier state data, all their polygenic risk score data, all their cancer predisposition gene data. There's just so much that has never been packaged to give back to participants.
Why is that?
Well, it's easy to give ancestry and traits that you might get from the companies today, but the sensitivity about giving, as you said, Francis, when you give a pathogenic mutation, that stirs people up, and as Javier mentioned, some people don't want to know. Yeah. They're afraid. The Cassandra story thing. So, this is, I think, where we're still having a problem in terms of doing the demonstration studies, like they started that, some years ago now that was finished, but taking it much further and getting over those barriers that you're referring to.
And I could pick up there, Eric, in that one thing about that is Geisinger is a payer and a provider. And so they have incentives because they have a population that they care for and they're on the financial hook for that population. And I think that the implementation studies that we need to do need to be in environments where there are an alignment of incentives. So a lot of the work that I've been doing in this pharmacogenetics thing I talked about, that's all within an employer-sponsored health plan. And by the way, we run our own health plan. We have 60,000 members. Many of them are frontline employees. We're paying most of their healthcare costs. We have them on average for 10 years. We've had people at Quest for 40 years on our health plan. So those incentives are very pure, right? And so when we look at implementation of genetic solutions within that health plan, we're all in, right? But if you begin to implement outside of that environment in a fee-for-service environment, the incentives aren't all there. And even in a health plan, the incentives aren't there because of the churn of the people that go through. So,
And also the significant investment.
that is required,
right?
So who's going to make that investment? And I mean, I'm just in it in the self-insured employer environment. It's one place where I think we are starting to invest, and the incentives are pure, and the data's all there too, so that you can look at the health economics, and you can look at days off work and publish those results and get some good implementation science out.
Completely agree that what we have right now is an implementation problem, and my theory and our theory that we've been really acting on is how do we make the right thing easy to do, and if we make the right thing easy to do, it'll get done more. And so a big part of what we've done is not only think about how do we look at the impact on genomic information on the total cost of care, which that's another outcome one, takes longer to understand the impact on total cost of care, but also on how we actually make the actionable possibilities we get out of the whole genome sequencing be visible at the point of care when somebody's making a decision. So with pharmacogenomics, it's not only looking at what people are on today, but building alerts in our electronic medical records so that if you prescribe something that you know through the pharmacogenomic information, 2 years from now, that it's not at the tip of your fingers, right? But the EMR can continuously be scrolling at the data embedded in the EMR, and if we ensure that the pharmacogenomic information is embedded in an alert system, then we can make that information be available to the doctor and the patient anytime that a potentially problematic drug is prescribed. And so really figuring out what are the systems we can put in place that make that genomic information not just available, but useful for the person to be able to change their behavior and change their health outcomes.
Yeah, if I can. Yeah, maybe building on that a little bit. I think the other piece that is a big gap and a big barrier for us in the implementation of genomics is education of healthcare providers. And that goes to your point, Amy, that while we need the tools for clinicians, for nurses, for healthcare practitioners to be able to use this genomic information, but we need to also train them and when to prescribe a test, create that awareness that genomics can help in their practice. And I think there is a big, big gap on that. And the other gap, I think, which is just not just for genomics, but and we saw it so clear during the pandemic, is the equity and access gap. It's like we are developing these technologies. Some of our countries, the US, Canada, Europe, are benefiting from that. And even inside our countries, there are many populations that are not really seeing the benefits of genomics.
So what are your ideas?
Yeah, I think, what we're doing now in Canada, we have several projects that are we have a project called Silent Genomes Project, working with indigenous communities starting with the indigenous and from the indigenous communities to create a governance framework to generate and manage their own genomic data, which is a big difference as opposed to us going there, taking samples and us managing the samples. So we're trying to a little bit shift the way we do genomics with those underserved populations or underrepresented populations. The other, I think we're all somewhat working on is trying to increase diversity and representation of other populations in these big data sets that we have. We have data sets that are representing 80% white Caucasians. So we need to increase, African populations, Latin American populations that be represented in those cohorts. I think it's really a collective and global effort we need to do to increase that diversity. And as soon as we increase that, I think we will open more doors to the use and application of genomics and benefits for other populations.
So Jay, how do you deal with that? You get the samples that come to you. Does that represent humanity? And
Well, that's a great opportunity. Actually, is to use the the big data that we do have. And one of the things we've done is to create a genomic data sharing network where we agree with Boston Children's and several other pediatric hospitals that all of our whole exome data goes into a database. It is shared for mutual annotation benefit and for research benefit. And I think those networks are underutilized in this. I do want to go back to one comment. I think there's a nuance on the physician education piece that's important, which
I'm going to come back to the...
We're going to come back?
That's a big, hairy topic that we're not going to miss.
Yes, yeah. Let me just say the nuance is Dr. Topol probably could figure out 400 mutations across 500 medications, right? And 10 years ago, that was kind of the model. Let's educate the physicians to figure out, and no, it makes no sense at all. We have computers that do that. We have professional pharmacists that do that. But I do see physicians moving more toward, you're not going to learn all those interactions, but you're going to understand it and be ready to interact with the pharmacist on it, or be ready to work with the computer on it. So I think there's been a shift from the old school, medical school, learning all the genomics to learning how to use it and
But we're
work
not
the
going
system.
to convince doctors unless they see the benefits, right?
Yes.
And for that, we first have to get the benefits. Eric, I know you've been working with Genomics England, and that you know a lot about that. Are they leading the way in any of this?
Well, not with Genomics England specifically, but a few years ago I was asked by the UK government to help in a review of the NHS
Yes.
for genomics, digital medicine, and AI, and how it would change the workforce. So I got really acquainted with how they are the world leader in genomics. And they aspire to be the same in
And
other
explain
areas.
why that is.
Well, one reason is what Jay touched on, which is they have universal health care. It's a big advantage. The other is, which is really interesting, unlike our government and NIH, which we have no education wing, the NHS has Health Education England, which is responsible for educating all the clinician workforce so that they all feel grounded. That is the physicians, the nurses, the pharmacists, with all of genomics. We have nothing like that here. So obviously they have other programs. I saw Rory Collins here earlier at the UK Biobank, Genomics England. They have lots of great research programs. So, I think one of the differences here is from here and the UK and other countries as well is that a big emphasis on education, which is a stumbling block. Because even when you have, Francis, as you're alluding to, compelling data of value, changing the outcomes, you still have this lack of familiarity and the delay it would take to actually be incorporated into daily practice of medicine.
Yeah, so we presented this year at ASCO preliminary data in a couple of studies, the 90S study by the Institute of Cancer Research and Royal Marsden in the UK, and another study in Spain. And it showed that approximately 20% of the people that were carriers of cancer-related pathogenic variants already had an early stage tumor. And this allowed for people to understand the benefit of it, but what's more important for the clinician to understand the value in delivering elective genome or running a genome, whole genome sequencing on a patient. And understanding that approximately 70% of those patients would have been undiagnosed following the current NHS guidelines is even more important.
But then why is there so much pushback from the medical community on very early stage screening?
Well, we think that it goes back to what Eric was mentioning. It's about education. It's about fear of not knowing what to do with those results. Should I trust the results? What should I do with the patient? What is next? And it's about, I think it is the obligation and the challenge the medical community has about helping clinicians face those situations better.
Can I have a counterpoint to that one?
Please.
There's also the idea that there's very early tumors that the immune system just takes care of. right? So is there a risk of overdiagnosis for looking at very early tumors because your body would have just eliminated those? So that's where I keep going back to the data. So we really need to figure out, are we making a difference in longevity? Are we making a difference in quality of life by diagnosing these very early stage tumors? And I think the jury's still out on that. Again, I have a hypothesis, but it's a hypothesis, it's not proof.
How many years does it take to do that?
Again, I think it takes, if you have a lot of patients, it takes less years. If you have a few patients, it takes a lot of years. But so we had to find other ways to
mark progress.
To mark progress, but also to get doctors and patients excited about the potential of genomics, because we want to learn. We want to be able to aggregate enough patients that we can start getting answers to these questions. And so in the US context, what is it that would make genomics worthwhile for a doc to do? And our theory is that, hey, you're going to be the cutting edge doc that people are going to seek out because you actually know how to embed genomics into practice. And you can sell that you're the cutting edge doc. And for patients, you want to get your care from a doctor who actually knows the latest and greatest, isn't keeping up with the literature. And so there's actually a benefit to growing your practice as a clinician to embed genomics in there. And so by doing that, Providence employs about 10,000 doctors. We have 25,000 on staff at our hospitals. And we had about 2,000 docs raise their hand and say, hey, we want to get educated and we want to join in this study so that we can learn how to embed whole genome sequencing and actionable possibilities into our practices.
Right. You want to be at the edge, but not the bleeding edge, right? So Eric, what did you?
Well, I think what is nice as a transition to our subsequent speaker, President Obama, is that he started the All of Us program, which is the most ambitious medical research program in U.S. history. Now with hundreds of thousands of active participants, the first 100,000 whole genome sequences were obtained earlier this year and are being shared and are getting back to the participants. And soon there'll be the wave of getting back the pathogenic variants, not just the basal things that was already mentioned, Amy mentioned. But notably, half these people are from underrepresented minorities, which is really the first large-scale biobank to have this. So in some ways, these citizen scientists, the people that signed up, that are interested in their genome data and all the other data that they're going to be getting as a result of participating in the program, that's a longer-term plan to get the value demonstrated and also the engagement, because maybe we can't work through doctors and clinicians. Maybe we have to work direct to participants to get the excitement about this era of genomic medicine going forward.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to that big topic of education. How do we educate the clinicians as well as the consumer, the patients?
Yeah, well, maybe I can comment on that. And I think the role of the patients has been historically in genomics underestimated. And we have been focusing so much, at least in our experience in the work we do with Genome Canada in Canada, so much on really the role of the researcher, the PI, the principal investigator, how the data is being generated. We are now starting to involve patients in our research oversight committees. We're starting to involve patients in our presentations of, we don't have, in Canada, we don't have All of Us, we have All for One, which is a bit of a different initiative, but it's for rare diseases. So we are, as part of our steering committee for All for One, the Canadian version, we are bringing patients, we are starting to be much more active in that patient interaction with the patients in this research community. I think that's important. And I think we all talk about 23andMe and for good and for bad and the challenges around the direct-to-consumer. But I think there is an important educational component that these companies are playing in making people aware of what the genome and what genetics and what genomics is doing. So I think.
So do you feel that patients will play an important role in making sure that clinicians learn genomics?
Well, when people are getting 23andMe, they're going to the general practitioner to see what does it mean?
Right.
What do I do with this? And the general practitioner will have to say, I don't know,
That's right.
or I have to read and figure out.
Well, we were talking about this earlier. It seems surprising that some changes, well, in academics, they say that change happens one academic death at a time. Hopefully, hopefully that healthcare practice won't be so slow. But how do we educate a generation of clinicians who never studied genomics in medical school, and apparently still don't much?
If I could take that. You know, demand, I totally agree. Demand drives clinicians continuing to learn, right? So if your patients come in asking about, what, you know, should I get this genetic test, the doc better have some background in knowing. So patient demand can drive it. The other thing that can help is two things, I would say, is the revolution in online education. So now, you know, my son is working on a master's in data science, and he could either go on a campus and pay $50,000 a year, or he can do it on Coursera for, I don't know, $1.95 or something. And you can learn online with really high quality content now in a way that makes it much more accessible to you. So that's one thing, that lowers the barriers of education for us to be able to have different modalities. But the second thing is that, and I had another point, but I don't remember it.
How about genetic counseling?
Genetic counseling, that was it, is that money matters in genetic counseling. And right now, there's a lack of supply, but there's a bill being in consideration that actually would pay genetic counselors as providers that would allow us to recoup the money. And it turns out that people do what you pay them to do. And so if we can actually pay people to be genetic counselors, and you can offer virtual services as much as possible and lower the cost of care, you can make it much more accessible and actually grow the demand, and therefore you'll have a grow in the supply match.
So we only have a few minutes left. We're kind of the warm-up band for the, the concert here. But I wanted to end on a high note, and that is your vision for the future, right? What does the future hold for genomics and for healthcare? And Eric, we'll start with you.
Well, as I started at the beginning here, was that it always takes a lot longer, and we tend to be, especially, I'm very impatient. But when you think about it, it was projected, you know, at some point we'll have billions of people who have had their genome sequenced, which will change preserve their health. Ultimately, I do think that's true. I think that we were quite naive in the early part of this century when we thought that this was the operating instructions, and we've learned that this is just, you know, one part of a multimodal way to understand each individual. And in fact, we have to integrate the other layers of data, whether it's the gut microbiome, the environment, the exposome, the digital sensors, physiome, if you will, anatome, all these other layers of data. So I think as we get smarter, we eventually will have ways to prevent diseases that otherwise would occur in one's lifetime. And that's, I think, the dream, the fantasy of the preventive medicine that we've never had.
Do you see the path to getting there? And we don't have time to go through that path, but...
Yeah, no, I do. I think if it wasn't for the fact that we're seeing foundation models in AI right now, and the ability to work with this massive amount of data and integrate in real time, getting feedback to the individual, we might not be able to do. But I think the analytical capabilities, the computing capabilities, we'll get there. And
fantastic.
So, yeah, I'm very optimistic, but I also know we have to be patient.
Okay, quickly, Catalina, what's your vision?
Yeah, well, for me is, well, a multi-omic but also multi-sectorial vision. Of course, we are here talking today about human health, but the power of genomics to sequence every single living organism. So it's not just about humans, it's our interactions with the environment, it's our interactions with animals, with plants. So thinking about genomics a much broader picture, I think is the future, and we're doing it. You know, we're sequencing all kinds of species, we're sequencing our biodiversity, we're thinking about genomics and climate change, we're thinking about genomics.
We're all part of a marvelous fabric.
So absolutely, that's
fabric
the future,
of
where
life.
genomics is every single living organism will be sequenced, and we will help use this information to help us make a better planet.
Jay.
Implementation science at scale, more of what I was talking about on pharmacogenetics, because the skeptics or a skeptical person can always poke a hole in it until you've taken it all the way through with all of the downstream actions and shown clinical and health economic benefits. So we need more of that, and I think we will be seeing that.
Javier.
It's easy. Every single individual on Earth is going to get their whole genome sequenced. And the power of that and what we are going to be able to learn and how we are going to be able to prevent disease, to understand the risks an individual is going to face over time, and how we spend the money in healthcare is going to totally change the world.
I like that.
Very much exactly what he just said. Change happens slowly than all at once. And I do see a future where we are better able to understand our risks. The power of our own health becomes in our own hand. And then you get significant either elimination or at least compression of disease to late in life because you were able to control your own destiny.
Let's make it happen. Thank you, panel, for a
Thank you.
wonderful discussion.
Thank you.